Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can mouse over or tap on the video playback area of your screen to see the chapter titles with links to each of the sections. Or you can use the time-stamped links down in the video description. This week I have a couple of tidbits. I have two projects that I started and finished, and then I'm going to respond to some comments and questions that have come up in the past few weeks. So let's get started. Last week I was telling you about a database archive of Canadian mail order catalogs that span from the late 19th century up to the mid to late 20th century. So one of the things that you could buy from those catalogs was yarn. And one of the things that was a mystery to me was a yarn that was described as wheeling yarn. And I had never heard of this term. I didn't really know what it was. And I was doing some research, which I shared with you last week. Well, I originally found out about this database archive in the historic knitting group on Ravelry. So as I was questioning what wheeling yarn was, I was posting to the group to see if anybody else knew, and I was posting what I was learning about it and the pieces I was trying to put together in my mind. So in this discussion thread a couple of days ago, somebody else posted a link to a book that was written in 1918 that was really interesting. So the book was called How to Make 70 Useful Articles by Maud Churchill Nicoll, or Nicoll, maybe is her last name. I'll put her name here. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And I'll put a link to that book down in the video description, as well as a link to the discussion in the historic knitting group. So the woman who wrote this book was an American woman. And at the start of World War I, she trained at the YWCA to be a nurse, with the intent of going over to Europe and being there and helping soldiers, injured soldiers, and all of that as part of her contribution to the war effort. So she went overseas in, I think, something like July of 1915, and she was promptly run over by a car. So she was convalescing there for literally 2.5 years. And the foreword of the book was written by her husband, who is back here in the United States, and said in that 2.5 years she was confined to her bed and could still only barely walk with the aid of crutches. So while she was confined, what she decided to do was to knit and sew items for soldiers. And so she had amassed an incredible number of different patterns and types of things that could be made for the soldiers. And so she wrote this little book to have it published in the United States. And one of the things in that book is a color plate. So it's a photograph of all these different kinds of yarns that were listed in these patterns that she had compiled. And so they were using yarns that were available in Britain, and that's what she was knitting using those patterns. And so she had pictures of them, and each of the yarns, if it was a plied yarn, they were unplied, so you could see each of the individual strands, and then it noted what type of yarn they were. And then in her book, she said what you could use in the United States as a substitute. And so a number of the yarns that were used were wheeling yarns, and apparently they were used quite a lot for soldier socks. And I found this really interesting because wheeling yarn is a type of woolen spun yarn, and woolen spun yarn is known to have more insulating properties. It's warmer than worsted spun yarn, but at the same time it wears through much more easily than a worsted spun yarn. So these days, if you buy sock yarn, it is worsted spun. It's tightly spun, and with the addition of nylon to make them harder wearing. So I found that really fascinating that they were using woolen spun yarn for these socks, because that was one of the things about World War I, is how many socks that the soldiers would go through because of marching or being in the trenches and having wet feet. And they needed so many changes of socks, and they would wear through them so quickly they would only last a couple of weeks. So I found that really interesting that those patterns called for wheeling yarn, which was a woolen spun yarn. Wheeling yarn was also a less expensive yarn than other yarns, so maybe it was just economics that that was what was used for soldier socks. I really don't know, but I thought that it was really interesting to see these color photographs of yarns from that time period where you could really clearly see what they looked like. So I'm going to leave links to that book down below. Last week I was showing you some of the tools that I use personally when I'm tracking projects or preparing to work a new project. And one of the things I tend to do is rechart patterns. If there's a chart that comes with a published pattern that I'm using, I'll rechart it, and I like to get a big picture of how all of the different stitch patterns are laid out in the context of the entire pattern piece. And I always create a spreadsheet as well. And one of the functions of that spreadsheet is just to kind of track where I am in the pattern, what different sections, what's going on, and if there are at the same time instructions where I have to do a decrease and a cable cross and a this and a that. If there's multiple things going on, it's just a little note reminder of that. One of the things that I use the spreadsheets for, though, is to calculate the stitch counts of a project. So one of the comments last week was that it seemed like KnitCompanion would be a better suited program for keeping track of where you are in a pattern. And what I didn't mention last time, but what I usually mention whenever I talk about these spreadsheets, is that I'm using these spreadsheets to do calculations for me. So I'm keeping track of stitch counts, but that's done by doing calculations. So if I have a decrease, I have to decrease 2. I'm having the spreadsheet subtract 2 from whatever the previous stitch count was. I'm not manually typing in what those stitch counts are. And so if I need to change things, if I need to add more decreases or reduce them, or if I need to change the rate I'm doing decreases and the number of rows I'm doing, I can have the spreadsheet recalculate things for me. And I also have it keep a running stitch count with the total number of stitches. This is something that I like. I just like having information about how many stitches are in a project and how far along I am, because I do like to also track how far along I am in my project. Every 5% I'll update the project. So that's what I use the spreadsheet for. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about KnitCompanion, because what works for one knitter, namely me, is not what's going to work for other knitters. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what KnitCompanion is, because many knitters do find it to be an incredibly useful application for them. So first of all, it's a mobile app. So it's for a phone or a tablet. And I'm on a computer all day. I don't use obviously I have a phone and I do have a tablet, but I don't use them in my regular work life every day. I'm on the computer, and I'm using programs to create my charts and do those kinds of things. So that is where I am already. And KnitCompanion is not meant to be run on a regular computer. Secondly, I design a lot of my own stuff. I'm not using published patterns, and lately in the past couple of years when I am using a published pattern, oftentimes it's a vintage or antique pattern, and it's just not, it doesn't present instructions in a way that is useful for actually knitting from the instructions. What KnitCompanion allows you to do is load a PDF, a digital file of the pattern, and it allows you to do things like find where you are in the pattern and have it highlighted across there. You can have markers in there, or you can have row counters in there that you can use. And so there are a lot of tools that many knitters do find useful. They just aren't tools that I find useful for me and the format that what I'm working with when I'm knitting is presented in. I did think it was worth mentioning that KnitCompanion might be something that would work well for some of you, even though it doesn't work for me, because every knitter is different, and what works for one knitter is not what's going to work for another knitter. So last week I had this hat in progress, and it's a hat for my husband. This is an example of the lies that a knitter can tell themselves and just keep going forward. I usually knit a hat for my husband every winter, and at first it was I would pick out some hats and say, "Oh, do you like this?" And "Oh, no, I don't like that." And so now he'll pick out the hat that he likes, and what he really liked was the way that the crown decreases were worked in this hat. The hat is called Antler. And this is the Canadian term for hat. Is it toque or toque? I think it might be toque. Antler Toque, and I think this is by tincanknits. It's a free pattern. Their patterns are really well written, but I will say, in this particular case, there was a problem with the information that they gave up front. And I knew that there was a problem with it. So I used the information that they provided, and then I just trusted that it was going to work out. And I tried the hat on myself as I was knitting it, and I knew it was tight. And I kept knitting it, and it was still too tight. And I didn't have my husband try it on until I was about ready to start the crown decreases. I wanted to make sure that the length was long enough so that when I did the crown decreases, the total length would work out to be what he wanted. But I hadn't had him try on the hat in the meantime. I had tried it on, and I knew it was tight, and it was tight. But he didn't want me to reknit it because he thinks that's too much work. I didn't want to give him a hat that he liked that didn't fit him right. So I pulled it all out. So I want to explain to you what the information was that they gave me and what information that they didn't give me and why that ended up being a problem when I was knitting this hat. So this is a hat that has some 1x1 ribbing. And then there's this cable pattern. So the cables themselves are 16 stitches, and it's all in stockinette, and that's where the cable crossings are in the stockinette. And then they're separated by columns of purls, and how wide those columns of purls are depend on the size of hat that you're going to knit. So the gauge information that they give for the pattern is 4.5 stitches per inch on size 8, which is a 5mm needle. And then they say for sizing information, they tell you it's going to fit what head size each size is going to fit. But they don't give you finished size, and they don't tell you how wide the actual cables are when you knit them. What's valuable about being given the stockinette gauge is that it helps you figure out what needle size you are actually going to need. So they said 4.5 stitches per inch on a size 8 needle, and I knew that I get 4.5 stitches per inch on a size 8 needle. So I didn't need to do a gauge swatch for stockinette. I had the information I needed. But this hat, the cables are in stockinette, but the cable crossings changed the stockinette gauge. So they didn't say how wide the actual cables were. If they had done that, I could have added up how much the total width of the cables were going to be, and I could tell how big the hat was actually going to be when it was finished. And instead, they told me what size head this hat was going to fit. So this hat calls for 95 stitches around the hat to fit a head that is 21 inches. So if you take 95 stitches and you divide it by the 4.5 stitches per inch, you will get a 21-inch circumference. But hats need to be smaller than your head and then stretch a little bit to fit. So I knew that this hat would be smaller because of the cable crossings, but I didn't know how much smaller. So my husband has a 22-inch head, and the choices were to fit 21-inch or to fit 23-inch. And what I thought I knew about him was that he did like a hat to be a little bit snugger rather than a little bit looser. So I decided to choose the one that would fit the 21-inch head rather than the 23-inch head. And so that was a mistake. The real mistake was that I kept knitting the hat even as I was trying it on, and I knew it was too tight. As I was knitting the hat, this serves as a gauge swatch in itself. I could have measured the width of the cables and then realized, no, I need a lot more stitches. Let me just rip this out. Now I just kept going. I just kept going because I just didn't feel like ripping it out. But once I had my husband try it on and I knew, and it was obvious that it wasn't going to fit him, then I was prepared. I'll just rip it out and reknit the whole thing. And so then I did the calculations I needed in order to figure out how much bigger I needed to make it. And in the end, I made the hat that says it's to fit a size 23-inch head. Again, my husband's head is 22 inches. And while this hat fits him really well, he does kind of feel like, oh, I wouldn't mind if it was a little bit looser still. It's still kind of it's not tight, but it's a head hugging hat in the size that I did knit it. I just wanted to share with you that sometimes I just don't face facts. And as I said, as I was knitting the hat, I had a gauge swatch that I could have used to tell me what the actual measurement was. I even took a ruler and measured across, and I'm like, oh, this thing is only 16 inches around. I don't know why I just kept going through. I think I was in the zone and I just kept going. I really don't have any other explanation. I was having a video chat with my daughter who lives in Amsterdam a few days ago, and she was showing me their Christmas tree that they have. This is the first year they have a Christmas tree. Last Christmas was the first year that she and her boyfriend were living together, and then this is the first year that they have a tree. So it's their second Christmas together. And she was showing me that they had bought these ornaments that look like houses, and there's a little light inside. And she said that symbolizes our first Christmas together. And so we were looking for some kind of an ornament that would symbolize our second Christmas together, and we couldn't find anything, she said. So Sam put one of the masks that you made us and hung that on the tree instead, which I thought was funny. But she was talking to me about, could you make this kind of ornament or that kind of ornament? Because I've made some knitted ornaments for her, for her friends of hers in the past, little sweater ornaments. And so I said, I know there's like little stuffed coronavirus stuffies of some sort on Ravelry. So I went and I found 3 or 4 different ones that were like these little gray balls that had little red knobs coming out of them. And but I found one that had a little face and was wearing a face mask. And so I showed that one to her and she liked that. So that's what I made for her. I'm going to be shipping it off. And so put little safety eyes in there and then knit a little mask for it. So it was a fun little thing to, I just used some of my leftover yarn stash in the gray and the red. And then there's a little, I'll put a photo up so that you can see it more clearly with this. They have you just embroider a little random yellow and orange X's on there too. If you ever look at a photo of the coronavirus, you can see these little orange and yellow bits on there. And then it's the face mask is tied in the back. So this pattern, it's a pattern that it's a paid pattern, but the proceeds go to some coronavirus relief fund in the UK. It's not meant to be an ornament, so I did this little crochet chain on the top. So I attached, I did a slip knot and crocheted, slip stitched to attach the red chain to the top of the ball, and then I did a chain for I think about 8 inches, and then I folded it over, and then I did some slip stitch for about 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch to the base, and then I attached it again with crochet. And then I had a couple long tails, the starting tail and the finishing tail, and I whip stitched all the way around at the base, and I thought, well, it's kind of ugly. I wanted to make sure that this loop wouldn't come out, and so then I used an embroidery stitch called chain stitch and just went around the base at the top. So there's like another knob here that's just my embroidery and making sure that this chain is not going to pull loose from the top. Then I went through and I tacked down the base of the mask here, and at the back of the ties I double knotted those, and then I anchored those as well. So I just wanted to make sure that none of this would come loose in shipping or over the years when they hang it from their tree. So this is a kind of thing, we don't have a tree in our house, but I grew up with a Christmas tree, and there's something about little knitted ornaments. I don't like knitting toys very much, but there's something about knitting ornaments that I really love. A couple of years ago, I found this little pattern on Ravelry. It's just a little acorn, and it was just really fun to knit. It was just something little and fun, and I have a whole set of Knit Picks palette. It's called, it's fingering weight yarn that comes in. It was like huge set of balls of yarn, in fact 50-gram balls of yarn in all of these different colors. So in that original palette there would be like a light yellow, a medium yellow, and a dark yellow. So the idea was that they all go together, so you can use them in like stranded color work and know that they would go together. And I had to have bought those more than 10 years ago, and I still have hardly ever used any of it. But I do pull it out every once in a while in order to make a little ornament. And in this case, I was using it to do the embroidery on here and to do the little mask. So I don't know why I like doing those, but it's fun. Okay, so I want to answer some questions and respond to some comments that have come up in the past few weeks. So the first one was somebody asked in the Ravelry group about recommendations for posture. I think she had taken to sitting at the kitchen table, because she had her computer and she could, watch stream video, and she'd been sitting in the kitchen chair and she was finding that she was uncomfortable and was looking for suggestions about posture or maybe a different chair. And so what we talked about in that discussion thread was every knitter is different. So every knitter has a different body, they have a different posture, they have different chairs, and they have different knitting style. Knitting style is a combination of what hand you hold the yarn in, how you hold your needles, how you bring the yarn around, how you manipulate the needles, the kinds of tools that you use. All kinds of things go into what an individual person's knitting style is. And one person's knitting style may be very comfortable for them and not work for another person. So all of that means there's no way to give a blanket recommendation for what you should do in your individual situation. But there is a book that was written by a knitting physical therapist named Carson Demers. So this is a self-published book. So when you buy, you can't buy this on Amazon, I don't believe. You have to buy it from him. And he ships it out like 2-day priority if you're here in the US. So he goes through all the different things about like how you need to sit, how you need to hold your body, and how to hold your hands, and ways to go about changing things. So there's a lot of photographs in here. And again, because he's a knitter, he understands specifically what knitters need. So if you are wondering about what might help you, if you're having pain when you're knitting, if you're wondering what might help you, it's possible that this book could be of real benefit to you. Somebody asked a question a couple of weeks ago in one of my videos about how to measure gauge, because they have real difficulty counting stitches. Like after they count the first couple of stitches, their eyes just kind of cross and they can't keep track of where they are. And they were wondering if there was some kind of trick to that. And the trick is, you don't have to count the number of stitches in 4 inches. Instead, you can measure how wide a specific span of stitches is where you know the stitch count. So for example, if you do a gauge swatch, and whether you have a garter stitch border on it or you are a knitter who doesn't do a garter stitch border, as long as you can measure a couple of stitches in from the edge, because you're not going to measure, you're not going to include those stitches at the very edge. So let's say you cast on 30 stitches. As long as you can count a couple stitches in from the edge, put a pin in that where you are, and do the same on the other side, And so if you've moved in 3 stitches from each end and you cast on 30 stitches, then you know you've got 24 stitches in there. So measure that distance. You measure between the 2 pins. How wide is that? So that will tell you that you have 24 stitches per whatever that measurement is. So let's say that measurement is 3.75 inches. You divide the 24 by the 3.75. That tells you how many stitches per inch you have. If you want to know how many you have over 4 inches, then you can multiply that number by 4 inches and you can compare your gauges. And it works the same for centimeters. And you measure how many centimeters you have, divide the stitch count by however many centimeters you have, and then that tells you how many stitches per centimeter, and then you multiply by 10 to get the stitch count within the 10 centimeters. So this is a trick that works really well as well if you're doing something like a lace pattern where it's really hard to measure the number of stitches. Your gauge swatch probably is going to include a certain number of multiples of that lace pattern. So let's say the lace pattern has 8 stitches in each of the multiples, and you have, again, 24 stitches, like where those 24 stitches are, then you can just measure again that span, because that can be a stitch pattern that's very difficult to count individual stitches to try to figure out how many do you have in 4 inches. Instead, you figure out how many inches you have over the known number of stitches. Someone was asking on Ravelry in the past couple weeks why they would get the same stitch gauge when they switched needle sizes. What would cause that? So I'm going to give you a number of reasons why that might happen. First of all, you may have been using needles that were different sizes, but also different materials. Some knitters will notice that when they knit with metal needles, they have a looser or tighter gauge than when they knit with bamboo needles. It just depends. Some knitters will knit tighter on bamboo and looser on metal, and for some that it's the opposite. And those are needles that are supposed to be the same sizes. So if they are knitting with needles that are different sizes and also different materials, they may find that actually they get the same gauge on those 2 different size needles that are also different materials. So that's one reason. But it could be that the size that the knitter thinks they have in each of those needles is not the true size they really are. So let's say you're trying to compare needles like a US 6 and a US 7, which would be a US 6 would be a 4 millimeter and a US 7 should be a 4.5. Well, first of all, there are some size 6 needles that are 4.25 millimeters. So you have less of a difference between that 6 and 7 than maybe you think you have. And with such a minor difference, maybe you just don't notice much of a difference in stitch gauge. That's one reason. So different manufacturers will have different tolerances, and they may package needles that say that they're a certain size, but actually are somewhat different than what they say. And you'd only know if you had some really sensitive calipers exactly what size those needles were. So it could be that there's not as big a difference in the size as the knitter thinks that there is. So those are all things to look at. And from what I'm hearing from people who actually do measure their needles with calipers, is sometimes even needles from the same manufacturer that are supposed to be the same size won't be in reality the same size. So there can be some differences in that regard as well. So those are reasons why you might not see a difference in stitch gauge when you are using needles of different sizes. They could be different materials, they could be different brands, they could be not marked as accurately in terms of the metric size as the package indicates. So there could be a variety of reasons. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.